Andrea, and this is the question of the week, and it comes from Frankie. And he says, you mentioned the need for careful preparation of seeds and nuts. Could you tell us what we need to do to make these more digestible? Should we only purchase raw nuts or are roasted nuts okay? And to answer this question, I am going to back up a little bit and talk about seeds in general. So that would be grains, beans, and nuts and seeds. So what I want you to think about is the fact that any living being, being an animal or a plant or a human, ultimately what we want is to survive long enough that we can pass our genetic information to the next generation. That's just like a natural instinct that all livings have. Now, in the case of animals, we can defend ourselves when we are in danger. We can run and hide, we can fight back. But the thing is, seeds cannot do this because they don't have legs or arms to move around. They move around in other ways, but they are not as obvious or with fast results. So the way they make themselves less appealing to their predators so they can survive longer and pass on their genetic information is by developing substances that are toxic to their possible predators. These substances we call enzyme inhibitors and anti-nutrients. And what that means is that when we are going to eat seeds, we need to be careful with these anti-nutrients and enzyme inhibitors they carry. And we need to process the seeds in a way that we get rid of as much as possible of these enzyme inhibitors and anti-nutrients. So in the case of nuts specifically, the best method to do this is by soaking them overnight. So you have your nuts and you put them in a pot with water, clean non-chlorinated water to cover them, and some sea salt, and you let them soak overnight. Now, the next morning, you will have nuts that are far more digestible than the original raw nuts that you started with. But you can even make this process better and more practical for you as well if you dry the nuts after that. Because soaked nuts have a very limited time frame. They won't last more than several days. But if you soak them and then dehydrate them or dry them, then you'll have nuts that will last far longer, that you can just keep in, you can put in a jar and they're in the fridge or in a dark place in your pantry, and this way you can make good quantities of them at one time, and it is just a more practical process. Now, if you have a dehydrator, then this is a very easy thing to do. You just put your nuts, spread them in the dehydrator sheet, and let them dry for as many hours as they need to get nice and dry and crunchy. If you have an oven, then you need to control the temperature and put it in the lowest temperature that you can get in the oven, and some ovens won't go low enough. So you need to keep the door of the oven ajar. And the reason to do this as opposed to just bake them is that the lower that you can dehydrate them or dry them, the more of the nutrients that you will keep from the nuts. So that's why. Now, as far as buying roasted nuts, the big reason to not do it is that when nuts have been roasted, the temperature is not controlled. So they are probably roasted at very high temperatures, and you know that nuts have a high content of fat, and any fat when it's in contact with heat, high heat, and the air, it will start breaking down and getting rancid. This is very much the case with most nuts because most of them have high amounts of unsaturated fats in them, not saturated but unsaturated, and these fats are more delicate. So that's why you don't want to go with roasted nuts. Now, soaked nuts, or soaked and dehydrated nuts, have much better flavor profile, and if you start doing this, you will notice that it's going to be very difficult for you to go back to eating regular nuts that are just raw or that you buy in a baggie in the corner, because this process that you do to get rid of enzyme inhibitors and anti-nutrients makes them much sweeter and just much more delicious. So try to get in the habit of doing this. It's great for your health, and especially if you eat nuts on a regular basis, this would be a really important thing for you to do, because these anti-nutrients and enzyme inhibitors that they carry will start building up in your body after a while.